My parents destroyed my first startup and gave its clients to my sister. But when my $1.88 billion cybersecurity empire made headlines, Mom texted, "Family dinner, no excuses." I walked in with, "The first company I built had 24 clients in a shared mezzanine above an auto body shop on Fletcher Avenue. I was 25. Have you ever felt invisible in your family? Drop a comment with where you are and what time it is. I'd love to know who's part of our community." I didn't reply to my mother's text. I just read it, set my phone face down, and let the silence of my 16th floor office wash over me. 7 years is a long time to stay quiet. To understand the satisfaction of this moment, you have to understand the grease-stained mezzanine above a commercial auto body shop on Fletcher Avenue. That was where everything started. I was 25 years old, running a cybersecurity startup from a cramped room that constantly smelled of burning rubber and chemical solvents. My desk was a salvaged piece of plywood laid across 2 filing cabinets. The server closet shared a wall with an overheating water boiler, and I had to keep a fan running 24 hours a day just to stop the hardware from melting down. Despite the stained ceiling tiles and the noise from the pneumatic drills downstairs, the business was mine. I had ground my way to $28,000 in monthly retainer revenue. My anchor client was a firm called Becker and Marsh, bringing in $1,600 a month. I vividly remember filling out their initial intake form by hand because my cheap printer had jammed again. There was a faint brown coffee ring on the back of that document from the mug I was holding while the ink dried. That piece of paper was the physical proof that I was building an empire from nothing. But in my family, a daughter building an empire was treated as an inconvenience. My father, Garrett, was a retired commercial contractor. To him, real business was built with heavy machinery, legacy connections, and preferably by a son. My mother, Marilyn, handled his bookkeeping and enforced his worldview. Together, they operated on a system of patriarchal scarcity, where my technical sovereignty was dismissed as a cute little home project. They needed to diminish my work because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the daughter they had always overlooked was outperforming the sister they had always favored. That favored sister was Sienna. She was in her 30s, armed with a corporate MBA, and chronically unemployed. She possessed the polished presentation our parents valued, but none of the actual grit required to build a company. So, Garrett and Marilyn initiated a campaign of systemic gaslighting. They framed it as family duty. They insisted that my business lacked professional polish and that I was drowning in the administrative details. They cornered me during a Sunday dinner, leveraging every ounce of filial obligation they had to force me into hiring Sienna. They told me she would handle the client-facing operations, allowing me to focus on the technical work. I was 25, exhausted, and foolish enough to believe that family affection wasn't just a transactional subscription where I was footing the bill. I gave my sister the keys to the kingdom, not realizing she had been sent to dismantle it. I thought I was making an investment in my family. I thought giving Sienna a title and a salary would finally earn me a seat at their table. What people often misunderstand about toxic family structures is that they do not exploit you because they think you are weak. They exploit you because they recognize your value before you do, and they will weaponize your desire for approval to steal what you built. I handed Sienna the operations manual, believing she was there to help me scale. In reality, she was there to study my architecture, map my vulnerabilities, and prepare the ground for a corporate heist executed by my own blood. Sienna played the role of the diligent operations manager perfectly for exactly 2 weeks. She organized the filing cabinets, set up shared calendars, and answered the phones with the crisp, professional tone she had perfected in business school. I felt a brief, naive sense of relief. In the middle of the month, I left the mezzanine office early to conduct a week-long physical network audit for a prospective enterprise client out of state. I trusted my sister to close up shop. When I returned on Monday morning, the auto body shop below was buzzing with its usual noise, but my office was dead silent. I walked to my plywood desk and noticed a stack of warm, freshly printed pages sitting in the printer tray. It was the master client spreadsheet. Sienna had printed duplicates of everything. Every single renewal date, billing cycle, phone number, and contract term for all 24 of my enterprise clients. The copies she had left behind were the ultimate proof of her betrayal. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon panic or tears, but there was only a chilling clarity. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I quickly discovered that while I was out of state, my father had spent that entire week making methodical phone calls. Garrett leveraged his 30-year reputation as a local commercial contractor to systematically contact every client on that stolen list. He informed them that my firm was restructuring and that a newly formed entity named Vanguard Digital, headed by Sienna, would be managing their accounts moving forward. He assassinated my professional reputation over a span of 5 business days. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I drove straight to my parents' house and stood in their formal dining room to confront him. Garrett simply crossed his arms, looked me dead in the eye, and delivered the mandate. He told me I was running a toy business out of a closet above a garage. He insisted that Sienna had the MBA, the polish, and the pedigree to represent a real company. I was evicted from my office within 60 days because I no longer had the revenue to cover the lease. I packed my personal laptop and a box of cables into my car on a Tuesday morning. I left the key with the auto body shop owner and drove 4 hours away to a city where nobody knew my name or my father's reputation. I didn't break down during that drive. I viewed the situation not as a tragedy, but as a severe audit of my life's balance sheet. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, funding their egos with my labor. Now, the account was closed. The exile was not a punishment. It was the absolute removal of liabilities from my ledger, leaving me completely free to start over with cold, uncompromising precision. Staying in a town where my father's name commanded respect and my own had been reduced to a cautionary tale was not an option. I needed distance to rebuild, free from the shadow of their expectations. The sting of betrayal was profound, but the betrayal itself served as a brutal education. They had stripped me of my assets, but they could not confiscate my capability. I drove until the familiar skyline disappeared entirely in the rearview mirror, focusing only on the mechanics of survival and the meticulous strategy of my eventual return. I arrived in my new city with nothing but a laptop and a profound sense of emotional detachment. I refused to let despair dictate my actions. I secured an entry-level contract job at a managed IT provider doing basic network monitoring for $12 an hour. It was less than I used to charge my clients for a 15-minute consultation, but pride was an expense I could no longer afford. I rented a freezing studio apartment with a single window facing a dark, concrete parking garage. The radiator clanked violently every 20 minutes, serving as a metronome for my relentless work ethic. For 11 months, I saved every single dollar. I didn't socialize. I didn't take days off. I sat at a cheap folding table every night, drafting and rewriting my pitch until the opening line became pure muscle memory. I registered a new holding company, Blackwell Cybersecurity, and began cold calling prospects with methodical precision. The rejection didn't faze me because it was impersonal. It was just data. In year 1, I signed 4 clients. By year 3, my aggressive scaling strategies secured a lucrative contract with a regional hospital system that doubled my revenue overnight. The growth was exponential and entirely self-made. By year 5, Blackwell Cybersecurity operated a 24-hour security operations center. We secured classified government contracts and expanded our infrastructure across 12 states. I hired a brilliant lead operations specialist named Logan, who quickly became my chief operating officer. He was 30 years old, ruthlessly analytical, and the only person who knew the complete history of my exile. Together, we built an impenetrable corporate fortress. By year 7, a massive national defense firm recognized our market dominance and initiated a buyout. The acquisition closed at an astronomical $1.88 billion. After years of dilution across funding rounds, my personal payout came to exactly $94 million. I didn't celebrate with champagne or parties. I reviewed the wire transfer confirmation with the same clinical detachment I applied to a network audit. The financial victory was absolute, cementing my status as an untouchable entity. The acquisition made headlines across major business networks that very evening. My phone, which had been silent regarding my family for 7 years, suddenly lit up. Between congratulatory messages from industry peers and vendor notifications, a single text arrived from my mother, Marilyn. It contained exactly 5 words: family dinner, no excuses, She didn't offer congratulations. She didn't express pride. She issued a summons. They had ignored me when I was freezing in a $12 an hour studio apartment, but the moment my net worth reached 9 figures, they demanded an audience. I read the text twice. I didn't feel anger. I felt the cold satisfaction of an executive who knows that a long overdue debt is finally ready for collection. I set the phone down and looked out over the sprawling city skyline from my executive office. The audacity of her message was a testament to their delusion. Marilyn still operated under the assumption that the 25-year-old girl who desperately craved their approval was still alive. She believed that familial obligation was a leash they could yank whenever it suited them. They viewed my billion-dollar success as an extension of their own legacy, a dividend they were entitled to collect. They were entirely unprepared for the reality that the woman returning to their table was no longer family. I was a corporate liquidation. To execute this retaliation perfectly, I had to rely on a piece of intelligence that had fallen into my lap 3 years prior. I had received a bittersweet phone call from a man named Harlan Vance. He was a 62-year-old failed IT vendor and, more importantly, Garrett's former regular golf partner. Harlan's company had just filed for bankruptcy, leaving him bitter, broke, and stripped of any reason to keep my father's secrets. Harlan called me to deliver a devastating truth, fundamentally altering the landscape of my betrayal. Garrett had not destroyed my startup out of a misguided sense of fatherly love or favoritism for Sienna. The nepotism was merely a convenient cover story. The truth was that my father had secretly mortgaged family assets to throw over $850,000 into Harlan Vance's failing firm. It was a desperate, hidden investment funded by draining his retirement accounts and taking a second mortgage on the family home, a catastrophic financial gamble that my mother knew nothing about. When Harlan's firm began to collapse, Garrett panicked. He deliberately gutted my client list and redirected my highest-paying enterprise accounts to Harlan first, desperately trying to bail out his own bad bet. Sienna's newly formed Vanguard Digital was nothing more than a dumping ground for the leftover contracts when Harlan's firm collapsed anyway. The revelation was a criminal twist that eradicated any lingering trace of familial sympathy I might have harbored. My father had sacrificed my livelihood solely to cover up his own financial ruin. I absorbed Harlan's confession in total silence, thanked him coldly, and hung up. I brought the information directly to Logan. We sat in the conference room, stripping the emotion from the data. The truth wasn't a tragedy. It was pure, unadulterated leverage. Sienna's firm, Vanguard Digital, had been steadily bleeding revenue because she possessed zero technical infrastructure, forcing her to overpay third-party contractors just to keep the stolen clients online. Her company was dying. Rather than engaging in a petty emotional confrontation, Logan and I engineered a shadow execution. We quietly established a special purpose vehicle, an anonymous holding entity with a clean, legal corporate structure. 3 weeks before my billion-dollar headline hit the press, my mergers and acquisitions team approached Sienna with a buyout offer. We offered $150,000 to acquire Vanguard Digital and assume its mounting liabilities, framing it as a generous exit for a declining firm running on fumes. Sienna, desperate for an exit and completely unaware of the buyer's true identity, signed the paperwork without hesitation. The transaction was ironclad. Through that single, sterile, legal maneuver, I acquired her entire company. More importantly, every single original contract that had been stolen from me 7 years ago was legally transferred back under my corporate umbrella. I had bought back my stolen history with pocket change. Sienna celebrated her exit, blissfully ignorant that her savior was the sister she had robbed. The trap was perfectly set, leaving my family operating under the fatal illusion that they still held any power. Logan managed the transition logistics with flawless discretion. The beauty of the shadow acquisition lay in its total lack of emotion. I didn't need to scream or demand an apology to achieve justice. I simply weaponized the capital I had built to legally annex the remnants of their theft. The paperwork was filed, the funds cleared, and the contracts were seamlessly integrated into my infrastructure before my family even had time to digest my larger corporate victory. I had dismantled their legacy through standard operating procedures, ensuring that when I finally walked through their front door, I already owned everything they valued. 3 days after my company made international news, I used my newly acquired master key to enter Vanguard Digital's peeling strip mall office. I walked past the empty cubicles before the staff arrived, bypassing the buzzing fluorescent lights. I unlocked the third drawer of Sienna's filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled Original Clients. Inside sat the physical $1,600 Becker and Marsh intake form. My handwriting covered the lines, and the faded brown coffee ring still stained the back. I slipped it into a manila folder alongside the legal acquisition records. The symbolic reclamation was complete. When the evening of the mandatory family dinner arrived, I did not walk in alone. I brought Logan. I didn't bring him for moral support. I brought him to serve as an unyielding, objective corporate witness. Emotional hysteria was off the table. We were there to conduct an audit. Marilyn opened the door, her face tightening instantly at the sight of a variable she hadn't planned for. She tried to maintain control, offering a stiff greeting, but her eyes nervously tracked the manila folder tucked under my arm. I walked into the dining room. Garrett was sitting at the head of the table, extending his hand as if we were at a casual networking event. Sienna sat nearby, holding a glass of red wine, projecting a rehearsed, sickening warmth that attempted to erase 7 years of silence. I ignored my father's hand and sat down. Garrett smugly raised his glass, offering a condescending toast to my billion-dollar success, calling it not bad for a kid who started above an auto body shop. He was trying to claim partial authorship of my empire. I didn't lift my glass. I set the manila folder on the table and nodded to Logan. Utilizing a third-party witness removes all oxygen from a toxic manipulator. Logan opened the binder and began reading the official Special Purpose Vehicle Acquisition transcripts directly into the room, delivering the words with the cold, flat inflection of a judge issuing a ruling. He documented the humiliating $150,000 buyout of Vanguard Digital and the legal transfer of every stolen asset back to Blackwell Cybersecurity. Sienna's wine glass froze halfway to her mouth. The blood drained from her face as the reality of the shadow buyout hit her. Before anyone could speak, I dropped the name Harlan Vance into the dead silence. I laid the coffee-stained intake form on the table and methodically exposed Garrett's over $850,000 secret debt. I detailed his covert bailout and his desperate fraud. Garrett's fork clattered loudly against his porcelain plate. His jaw locked, and his left hand dropped below the table to grip his knee. His entire decade-long narrative of fatherly wisdom was shattered in front of his wife and favored daughter, replaced by the undeniable evidence of his absolute financial ruin. Marilyn stared at her husband, the illusion of their superior partnership disintegrating before her eyes. Sienna looked at the intake form, realizing her entire professional identity had just been liquidated by the sister she had dismissed. I watched them process the destruction of their leverage. There was no shouting, no dramatic pleas for understanding. The paperwork did the devastating work for me. They had demanded a family dinner to assert their dominance. But Logan and I had transformed their dining room into a corporate boardroom, executing a hostile takeover of their dignity with clinical, inescapable precision. Marilyn, desperate to regain control of the crumbling room, tried to weaponize guilt. She raised her voice, clinging to the delusion that she still held maternal authority. "Nobody builds anything alone," she snapped, insisting that Garrett had somehow helped me and that my success was a shared family asset. I looked at her with absolute zero empathy. I spoke in a calm, icy tone because the numbers were infinitely louder than any shout. I outlined the exact metrics of their betrayal. I reminded her that 7 years ago, I had 24 clients, and my father systematically called every single one to gut my livelihood. I told her I built my billion-dollar empire from a folding table in a freezing studio apartment with 0 family phone calls and 0 support. I informed Sienna that her beloved company was now nothing more than a minor subsidiary line item inside my holding firm. Logan closed the binder with a sharp snap. I picked up my coffee-stained intake form, pushed my chair back, and walked out of the house. We left Sienna staring blankly at a spilled streak of water on the tablecloth, her manufactured corporate identity completely erased. 11 days later, Marilyn tried one final, desperate emotional manipulation. She called me and weaponized a tragic memory, reminding me that when I was 15, I held her hand at my grandmother's funeral for 2 hours. She pleaded with me to hold on to this family. It was the ultimate boundary test. I responded with cold finality. I held your hand because nobody told me not to. You should have held mine when Dad gutted my company. I listened to the dead air on the line for exactly 4 seconds, processing the absolute end of my familial obligations. Then, I hung up and set the phone down forever. The fallout was swift and absolute. Sienna's primary contact at Becker & Marsh officially transferred all enterprise contracts back to my infrastructure team, repulsed by the stolen foundation of Vanguard Digital. Sienna deposited her exit check but remained paralyzed, unable to start anything new because she never possessed the grit to build from scratch. Garrett and Marilyn were left sitting in a quiet, sprawling house, staring at empty dining room chairs. I later learned from a mutual contact that Garrett sat in a grocery store parking lot, staring at my name on his phone for 9 seconds before setting it face down. He never dialed. The over $850,000 secret debt had cost him his entire legacy. I've come to realize that the ultimate justice isn't found in a tearful apology or a sudden revelation of parental love. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free by walking away. The uncomfortable truth is that blood relation does not confer an automatic right to access your life, your labor, or your wealth. Most people would excuse a mother's desperate funeral memory as a broken plea for unity, but that was never about unity. It was an invoice for my continued subjugation. Cauterizing toxic ties permanently, without anger or financial handouts, is the highest form of self-respect. True victory over a toxic family requires complete emotional and financial autonomy. I sit now on the 16th floor of my glass tower, looking out over the city skyline. Hanging on the wall directly behind my executive desk is not the $1.88 billion acquisition certificate. That document sits securely stored in a paper binder under the letter A, placed next to nothing important. What I framed is the original $1,600 Becker & Marsh intake form. The faded coffee ring on the back is invisible behind the glass, but I know it is there. I framed my origin because that is what I built with my bare hands when nobody was watching. That is what they maliciously stole, and that is exactly what I brought back home. Sometimes the ultimate justice isn't an apology. It's total, undeniable independence. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe to Betrayal Unfolded and share this video with someone who needs the courage to build their own empire. I'll see you in the next story.